Since 2002, the AU has suspended at least 15 member states following coups or unconstitutional power transitions, refused to recognize governments that come to power through force, sent mediation teams to countries facing constitutional crises, monitored elections, and called out fraud in some cases. This is significant. In the OAU era, coups were routine and accepted. Now they carry consequences, but the AU's democracy promotion has limits. It reacts to coups, but struggles with authoritarian regimes that maintain a veneer of legitimacy. Presidents who rig elections, change constitutions to stay in power, or suppress opposition rarely face AU sanctions. Countries like Uganda, Rwanda, Cameroon, and Equatorial Guinea have leaders who have ruled for decades through managed elections. The AU criticizes them quietly but takes no action. The AU can punish sudden unconstitutional changes but can't address slow authoritarian drift. Economic integration was one of the AU's founding goals. Progress has been slow but real. The African Continental Free Trade Area, AFCFTA, launched in 2019, is the AU's greatest economic achievement. It creates the world's largest free trade zone by number of countries. 54 African nations representing 1.3 billion people and a combined GDP of $3.4 trillion. AFCFTA aims to remove tariffs on 90% of goods, facilitate movement of people and capital, and boost intra-African trade. If successful, it could transform African economies from colonial-era extractive models to integrated industrial economies. But barriers remain. Infrastructure deficits, roads, railways, ports connecting African countries are inadequate. Non-tariff barriers, bureaucracy, corruption, and regulations still make cross-border trade difficult. Political will, some leaders fear competition will hurt local industries. Implementation gaps, signing agreements is easy, enforcement is hard. Still, progress is visible. Regional economic communities like ECOWAS have removed visa requirements for citizens traveling between member states. The East African community has a common passport. Cross-border infrastructure projects, railways, highways, power grids are being built. The vision of economic integration is alive, even if realization is slow. Perhaps the AU's most underestimated impact is on African identity. For centuries, colonial powers told Africans they were divided by tribe, by language, by region. Colonial education systems taught African children that their history began with European contact, that Africa had no civilization, no achievements, no unity. The African Union, despite its flaws, represents a counter-narrative. Africa is one. Africans share a common history, common struggles, and a common destiny. This psychological shift matters. A young person in Kenya now can see themselves as not just Kenyan, not just East African, but African. The AU passport, issued to diplomats and the officials, bears the words African Union above any national identity. African culture is increasingly crossing borders. Music from Nigeria's Afrobeats scene dominates charts across the continent. Films from Ghana, South Africa, and Nigeria circulate widely. Athletes compete under their national flags but are celebrated as African heroes. The AU hasn't created this Pan-African identity alone, but it has provided institutional backing for it. It has made Africa a legitimate political category, not just a geographical one. Before the AU, African countries often spoke with 50 different voices on the world stage. Colonial powers and superpowers exploited these divisions. The AU gives Africa a collective voice, however imperfect. At the United Nations, the African group coordinates positions on climate change, trade negotiations, international security. Africa increasingly speaks as a bloc. This has yielded results. Africa secured permanent representation in G20 discussions. African priorities, debt relief, fair trade, climate justice get more attention. Multinational corporations and foreign governments now negotiate with the AU Commission, not just individual countries, but challenges remain. Africa's voice is only as strong as its unity. When African countries disagree, as they often do, the collective voice weakens, and Africa still lacks permanent representation on the UN Security Council, despite repeated AU demands for reform. Still, the trend is clear. Africa is moving from being acted upon to being an actor. The AU is central to that transformation. One impact rarely discussed is the institutional culture the AU has created. Thousands of African diplomats, technocrats, and civil servants now work within AU structures. They meet regularly, develop personal relationships, build networks across borders. This creates a class of professionals who think continentally, not just nationally. The AU has also created norms and standards. When countries write new constitutions, they reference AU principles. When regional courts make decisions, they cite AU human rights frameworks. When civil society groups advocate for change, they invoke AU commitments. This normative power, the ability to set standards for what is acceptable, may be the AU's most lasting legacy. So what does the African Union really represent? On paper, it's an intergovernmental organization, bureaucratic, political, often frustrating. It has achieved some successes and suffered many failures. It deploys peacekeepers that sometimes work and sometimes don't. It promotes norms that sometimes stick and sometimes don't. It's perpetually underfunded, sometimes ineffective, and frequently contradictory. But here's the deeper truth. The African Union represents something profound: Africa's refusal to accept the world as it was handed to them. Think about what colonialism did. It told Africans they were inferior. It divided them artificially. It extracted their resources and returned nothing. It left them with borders designed to keep them weak, economies designed to serve foreign interests, and political systems designed to fail. The African Union is Africa's declaration. We will not accept this. We will rewrite our story. We will unite what you divided. We will reclaim what you took. We will define ourselves, not be defined by you. This is what makes the AU significant even when it fails. Every AU summit, every peacekeeping mission, every trade agreement, every instance of standing together, it's an act of resistance against a colonial legacy that tried to make African unity impossible. The question isn't whether the AU has achieved its full vision. It hasn't. The question is whether the vision itself matters. And it does. Because here's what critics miss. Nation building takes time. The United States, the model everyone points to, fought a civil war 85 years after independence. The European Union, another model, took decades to develop and is still struggling with unity. China's current form emerged after centuries of fragmentation and civil war. Africa is attempting continental integration barely 60 years after most countries gained independence. The artificial colonial borders are still fresh. The wounds of exploitation are still healing. The economic dependency is still being unwound. In that context, the African Union's mere existence is remarkable. That 54 countries with different languages, cultures, political systems, and economic interests can sit together and negotiate a common future. That's not weakness. That's extraordinary. The big lesson of the African Union is this: healing from colonialism is not a policy, it's a process. Unity is not a destination, it's a practice. And Africa's story is not written by its past. It's being written by its choices. The African Union is Africa choosing itself. The African Union in 2002 was born from hope and desperation. Hope that Africa could be more than the sum of its divided parts, and desperation born from decades of watching those divisions exploited. Today, more than 2 decades later, the AU is still evolving. It has expanded from peacekeeping to economic integration. It has launched the African Continental Free Trade Area. It has responded to coups and crises. It has given Africa a collective voice, however imperfect. But the dream of true continental unity, one Africa, one voice, one future, remains incomplete, as perhaps it always will be. Perhaps the point was never to achieve perfect unity, but to keep choosing unity despite the reasons to divide. What's clear is this: the story of the African Union is the story of Africa's post-colonial journey. Every success reveals how far Africa has come. Every failure reveals how far there is to go. And every choice to stay together, despite the pressures to fracture, is a victory against a history designed to keep Africans apart. The African Union is far from perfect, but it exists. And in a world that spent centuries betting against African unity, that existence itself is revolutionary. If this story moved you, if it taught you something you didn't know, if it made you see Africa differently, please subscribe to Africa Hidden History. Hit that like button, share this video with someone who needs to hear this story. And in the comments, tell us, do you believe the African Union can achieve true continental unity? What would that unity look like? What obstacles do you think are most difficult to overcome? Next episode, we are diving into another hidden chapter of African history. Until then, remember, Africa's story is still being written, and you're part of it.